Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is in your time zone. Let me start with a little bit of a reality check. You will never feel balanced. If you're anything like the leaders I've worked with in the past 40 years, not one of the leaders felt perfectly balanced. It doesn't happen. So just relax with it. But in this session, what I'd like to do is share with you a tool that will help you feel as balanced as you can from my perspective. Because it is actually easy to come to a feeling of balance, even though at another level you'll feel you haven't quite got balance at any time. And here it is. You'll never feel balanced unless you schedule it a year in advance. There are two calendars you want to keep in your thinking. One is an annual balance calendar, and one is a current yearly calendar. One is an annual balance calendar, which is basically what you do every year at this time. Every year at this time, you may feel this is your busy season, like in a church. You have Christmas and Easter are very, 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 very busy. Whereas there are other times in the calendar where it isn't really busy at all. That's when you take your vacations, when you do your planning retreats, etc. So if you'll keep two calendars and then schedule a year in advance, that's the best way I can possibly encourage you to keep a feeling of balance. Because every year you have certain months when you feel busy, like I say, and certain months where you feel where it's hardly anything happening. So what you do is you schedule all of your personal family vacations, your personal planning retreats, your staff planning retreats, all of the retreats you need, all of the time off you need in your slow times. And you don't schedule any of that during your busy times. Now, a lot of people ask, what do you mean balance? I say there are three kinds of balances you have. You have your professional balance, you have your professional personal balance, and then you have your personal balance. There are three areas really. Your professional balance is your planning retreat for your staff, your schedule for Easter, Christmas, etc. Then you have your personal professional balance, like when you're planning to write a book or when you're planning to take some time away to think through your next year or what your next steps are. And then you have your personal balance for your family, for your personal family, your extended family, like your parents, your grandparents, your siblings, etc. You have three things you want to really put into your annual planning calendar. What you want to do is make sure that in your off season, you put everything you possibly can in there. Everything you want is in your off season in terms of the things that you want to make sure are on your yearly planning calendar. Now, like I say, there are certain things. Let me show it to you here. Let me just bring this up. In your annual balance calendar, you have every year at this time. And then there are certain things that you have every year at this time, like your annual career path discussions where you're evaluating your team. You have your birthdays, put those on there, your board retreat days, your celebrations when you celebrate the good times you've had, or your due dates for next year's budget. You say, for next year's budget, we have to get it in by October 1st or something like that. You have your file cleaning where you take a day or two and just clean your files out. You have your maintenance cycles where you are maintaining your files, maintaining your buildings, maintaining your facilities. Your peak times when you say, like for example, Christmas Day, your month ahead of that is just busy as can be planning whatever you're going to plan for Christmas. Your personal days, your predictable emotional valleys. There are certain times when I've found that year after year after year, you have certain sort of emotional valleys. For example, if you're a pastor, a lot of times in the summertime, I found pastors have emotional valleys what happens is in the summertime, you have your people go away on vacation. They are not attending church. Their giving is down, but you have to be spending money for the fall season. And you feel like we don't have enough money. People are not coming. I just feel discouraged and blue. Well, realize you put on your, every year at this time, I may feel blue at this time because no one is coming and the giving is down. So that you remind yourself, this is an emotional valley. Quiet times. When do you want to be quiet? When do you want to have special events? Every special event you want to put on your every year at this time calendar and your team retreat days. Those are some of the kind of things you put on this every year calendar. And then about October of each current yearly calendar, you set some time aside in October, let's say the October 15th, where you sit down and you take your every year at this time calendar and you translate it into your current yearly calendar. So you say on October the 13th through the 12th, or 12th through the 13th, that's when we have our staff retreat or something like that. And then about October the 15th, you send your next current yearly calendar, all the dates for the next year, to your staff, to your spouse. You send it out so that everybody knows what's going on. Everybody knows what's coming up. Everybody knows what the plan is. And what's more, they will say, hey, this person is really organized. But basically make it so that every year you have that. Now, what this also does is when you get feeling overwhelmed, you begin to look ahead on your calendar and say, hey, we've got a break coming up here. It's also important to see that at certain times of the year, you are working probably 56 hours, 60 hours a week. That's not unusual for an executive. You may think, oh, I'm overworked. I'm working more than 40 hours. Well, every executive works more than 40 hours at certain times a year. This is something also this every year at this time, you refine year after year after year. And it's important to see that this all starts with the phrase, at this phase of my life. When you're 21, every year at this time looks very different than 31 every year at this time, which looks very different than 51 at this time every time. So it's like every phase of your life differs, but you can keep refining it year after year after year. Now, you'll never get balance. You'll never feel totally balanced, but this gives you a feeling of, at least I got the boulders in. I got the boulders in. A friend of mine, one time I asked him, how do you decide to pay someone the big dollars? How do you pay the person the most dollars in their salary? And he said, thought about it for a minute. He said, the person that can build me a strong team is worth a lot of money to me. And secondly, to put the right weight on the right variables. I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, I don't want someone to put $1,000 worth of time on a nickel problem, or a nickel's worth of time on a $1,000 problem. This every year at this time lets you put, where are the 1,000-pound pieces in the year? And how do I make sure they are on my current yearly calendar so that you get the right weight on the right variables? You've got the right amount of time set aside for each and every event you've got coming up. You've got times when you want to visit your parents. If you don't do this, you'll find year after year you don't visit your parents. You've got time when you really need to set aside for yourself to work on a book. If you don't set it aside, you won't set it aside in advance. If you don't set it aside in advance, you won't set it aside. Now, here's a kicker. Don't ever cancel one of those critical pieces. You can reschedule it in case of a funeral or something like that, but don't cancel it. And this piece, this every year at this time, is a tool you can count on 7 days a week, every month, 365 days a year for the rest of your life. Just keep it in place and it'll keep helping you find as much balance as you can find. Now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about analyzing any situation that comes up. Any situation that comes up in your life. I'd like to talk to you about how do you, now that you've got balance and there's a situation coming up, how do you deal with a situation? But instead of telling you about the theory of it, let me ask you this. Would you please get in mind a situation you're dealing with right now that you don't quite know how to deal with? You don't quite know how to deal with it. It's something you're wrestling with. It's something you're thinking about. How do I deal with this? Get that situation in mind. I'd like to share with you how to deal with that. Now take just a second and write down or put down, what is it that's that situation? All right, with that situation in mind, the first step you take is to ask yourself, what are the facts involved? What are the facts involved with your situation? What are the 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 facts involved in that situation you're wrestling with right now? And how do you distinguish between facts, which are what you know to be true, and assumptions, or what you believe to be true, whether they are or not? Let me give you a principle that a friend of mine shared with me one time. He said, all, underlined all, miscommunication is a result of differing assumptions. You might want to write this one down. All miscommunication is a result of differing assumptions. I tried to argue with him for about 3 months on that one. Finally, I've been teaching it for 40 years. Now, something I've added to that and results in frustration, pressure, and tension. Anytime you're feeling frustration, pressure, or tension with your spouse, your parents, your siblings, anyone, when you're feeling frustration, pressure, and tension, the reason is because you're making differing assumptions on the subject. So make a list of your assumptions and find out, are these facts or are these assumptions? Am I making assumption? Am I making a differing assumption than they're making? And how do we discuss it to the point where we say, you know, I think I was making an assumption that wasn't quite right. I was believing that that was going to cost us $20 a piece, and it's really going to cost us $50, which is what you were thinking. Therefore, I'm sorry, I've been making the wrong assumption here. Therefore, the tension settles out. The second thing you want to ask yourself or deal with is establishing the context. What is the context of the situation you're dealing with or trying to think through right now? Because the reality is that nothing is meaningful without a context. Nothing. You may say, well, isn't Jesus meaningful without a context? I said, well, it depends on which Jesus you're talking about. If the context you're talking about is Jesus Rodriguez of Mexico City, that's one context. If you're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, as presented in the Bible, the Holy Scripture, that's a totally different context, which establishes the meaning, helps establish the meaning of the word Jesus. So what is the context of the situation you're dealing with? What is the context in terms of time? How much time have we got to work with on it? Energy, how many people do we have to work on it? Money, how much money? What's the context? Do we have $1,000 to help solve the problem you're dealing with? Do you have 10,000, 100,000? Do you have 200,000 euros to deal with it? How much money do you have to deal with it? So those are some of the contexts you want to establish in trying to figure out, what does this mean? What is the situation? Because if you've got €1 to deal with it, it's one situation. It means something. If you've got 100,000 euros, that's a totally different situation. The third thing you look at is to identify the missing piece. This is a profoundly simple question that a lot of leaders forget to ask. You may remember the story of Sherlock Holmes, and he solved the murder mystery by asking the question, what's missing? And it was the dog that didn't bark. You remember that one? It was like, what happened here? Well, the dog didn't bark. Well, the dog didn't bark, that means something. What are the missing pieces? What's missing in the situation you're trying to figure out? What is it you don't have yet? What do you need to find out yet? What do you need to establish yet? Because sometimes when you figure that out, it really helps in answering or establishing the situation, identifying the situation. The fourth is, what's the ideal in the situation? As you define the ideal, you move from the acceptable. What's acceptable in the situation you're dealing with to what's best? And it applies to everything. I am not a philosopher. I don't study philosophy like some of the people here at the ELF does. But I read a statement one time by Aristotle. I like to read to you. It says, what you can do with things increases infinitely when you focus your thinking on their potential. When I first read that, I wanted to go away and spend about 10 hours just thinking about what's the potential of our company, not what it would take to get it to do pretty well, but what's the potential of our company. I realized that in terms of me, in terms of Bobb Biehl, I'd been thinking about what could I get done? What would be a good thing for me to get done? But in all candor, I hadn't thought about what's my potential. What is your potential? What is the potential of the situation you're dealing with? What would be the ideal solution to what you're dealing with? If right now you're thinking about which position should I take, which job should I take, what would be the potential of this one in 20 years, and what would be the potential of this one in 20 years? You see, sometimes that brings immediate perspective to the situation you're trying to deal with, you're forced to deal with. The fifth thing is ask the wisest people you know. Proverbs says a wise person seeks wisdom. One of the things to see is that you want to make a list in life of, just put a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and list it from 1 to 10, just number it from 1 to 10. And then make a list of the 10 wisest people you know. And what a wise person brings you is whenever you bring them a situation, they tend to answer 3 questions for you. What to do next, explain why that's important, and knowing how to bring the appropriate resource to bear on the need at hand. Whoever you've gone to in the past, that whatever you bring to them, they tend to ask to be able to answer. Well, I think here's what I would do. Here's why I would do it. And here's a resource. Here's a person or a dollar or something that they would bring to bear, is a very, very wise person. Now, make a list of 10 people. Identify who are the top 3. Often, to get perspective on your situation, all you have to do is go to the number 1 person, the wisest person, and there it is. There's your answer. Sometimes you have to go to number 2 or number 3 or clear down to number 8. But who are the wisest people you know, and how do you go to them for wisdom on the situation you're dealing with? Now, it's been asked in the past, what if you're in an emergency situation? How does this apply to an emergency? The more emergency the situation, the more you need 5 areas like this, 5 points like this, because you have to ask yourself fast, not, well, what could I think about? What do I need to consider? But you ask yourself immediately, what are the facts? Have I got the facts? What's the context? What are the missing pieces? What would be the ideal? And who are the wisest people I know? You can ask yourself those questions in a minute or 2. So you ask yourself, what are these 5 questions? Ask yourself about any situation, whether it's an emergency. You can ask yourself these questions. You can ask your family these questions. You can ask your mother or father. You can ask your close friend. You can ask the wisest people you know. You can discuss it, brainstorm it with your team. You can send out a survey to 100 people on your constituent list. But these are 5 questions, 5 areas that will help you process any position you have, any time in your life, 365 days a year for the rest of your life.